All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our last Hot Topics in Fire Science and Stewardship webinar. My name is Katie Lowe, and I am the statewide coordinator for UC ANR's Fire Network. And I'm co-hosting the webinar today with Fire Advisor Tori Norville. And of course, we're joined by our two wonderful speakers, Dr. Eric Knapp and Don Radcliffe. Before we get started, I want to remind folks of a few basic Zoom rules. So during the presentations, please keep yourselves muted. And then, of course, if you have questions for any of our presenters, you can ask them during the designated Q&A periods at the end of the presentation or by typing it in the chat, and one of us will read it out loud to them. So with that, I will go ahead and get started, and I'll hand it over to Eric Knapp. He is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. And I personally think this presentation will be very interesting to many of us in Extension and who live and work in any forested environments. This research is very applied and was very interesting to me when I first heard it. So with that, I will hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Katie. My name is Eric Knapp. I'm with the Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station, and I'm based in Redding. And just want to acknowledge Emily Brody and Chris Looney, my co-authors on this. Emily's now with CAL FIRE. But it involves, let's see, I am not, there we go. Yeah, I apologize. My animations aren't popping up like I'm used to, but I'm just going to go with it. So plantations in the Western U.S., they're in the past they've been established after timber harvest or increasingly after stand replacing wildfires. In the 80s and 90s, oftentimes there were small patch clear cuts created, but these days the stand replacing wildfire, like reforesting after wildfire, is much more spatially extensive. And some characteristics that make these plantations vulnerable to subsequent wildfires are small tree size, low height to crown base. They tend to be relatively even aged and with even spacing. So there's a certain amount of vertical and horizontal fuel continuity. And also, they tend to have a fair amount of understory shrubs and lack of surface fuel treatment. And the fuels tend to be fairly light in these plantations, but it's just that the trees are still small, and so just not light enough to withstand the subsequent wildfire. So it's a challenge in getting these plantations to grow to the next size class to mature forests, and therefore the interest in prescribed fire. Can we reduce the fuels in these plantations and have them more likely to survive a wildfire? So my apologies. This is not advancing like, there we go. Okay. So what we essentially did is we piggybacked on some prescribed burns the Shasta-Trinity National Forest was doing. And they had 4 plantations on the Trinity side of the forest on the west side that we monitored, and 5 on the McLeod Flats area on the eastern side of the forest. And just to give you an idea of what they were like, they ranged in age from 22 to 35 years. And averaged about 177 trees per acre, basal area just under 60 square feet, quadratic mean diameter, so the average size about 8 inches, and that ranged from about 5 to 11 inches. But the average height was only 33 feet, so it's not a very tall forest yet. And just to give you a sense of the pre-fire fuels in these plantations, and there's a lot of numbers here. The circles there just highlight some information that I think is useful. The Trinity plantations had higher fuel loading, so the west side was more productive than the McLeod Flats. But a lot of the plantations, and about almost 3/4 of the fuels in these plantations was just litter and duff. So it's fairly light. They weren't planted in slash for the most part. And so there wasn't a lot of material left over. I mean, what's on the ground was mostly like stuff from pre-commercial thinning, lop and scatter in the distant past. And then the McLeod plantations had a higher shrub cover, and that was mostly things like bitterbrush and manzanita. We burned 2 of the plantations in the spring, 7 in the fall, and they were burned under a range of fuel moisture and temperature and relative humidity conditions. And so we follow these plantations over time, and 3 years after the burns, looked at the mortality of trees. So the interest with these burns is we wanted to obviously maintain the large trees, but a lot of these plantations were far too dense, and there was some ingrowth as well, and those are mostly in these small size classes. These were natural trees that came in, not necessarily the planted trees. So if you see the 9 plantations here, and our average fuel, or I mean, our average mortality overall was like 17% for the intermediate size class and 10% for the largest trees. But we had one plantation, this McLeod 484 plantation, which was the outlier. And if you take that outlier out of it, you can see that the mortality was 10% and 4% in those categories. That's within the prescription range. It's what we were hoping to achieve. And so next, what factors were associated with initial tree mortality? And this is the mortality just right after the burns. See, one of them is shrub cover, higher shrub cover, greater chance of mortality, and that was largely because of bitterbrush and the McLeod flats. Low relative humidity, higher mortality, as you would expect. This is interesting. Tree diameter, larger trees, higher probability of mortality. And I think a lot of that had to do with fuels. When you have larger trees, you tend to have more litter and duff on the forest floor. And fuel moisture was not significant. Fuel load was probably the strongest variable, as you might expect. Grass cover and forb cover were negatively associated with mortality, and that's because you tended to have more grass and forbs in areas within the stand that didn't have a lot of trees, and so they didn't have a lot of fuel. So it's really driven by fuel. And next, we looked at the fire damage variables that were associated with delayed tree mortality. And this is, and so the variables included tree size, tree diameter. And you can see that, yeah, we had both ponderosa pine and Douglas fir planted. Smaller trees were more likely to suffer delayed mortality, but the overriding variable that affected delayed mortality was the percentage of crown that was affected by scorching. And that was significant for both ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, highly significant. Basal circumference charred was not quite significant. Char height, the low char height on the low side of the tree was significant for ponderosa pine, and burn season was significant for Douglas fir, but maybe not in the direction one might expect. Douglas fir trees, they survived better with early season or spring burns, and I think that was largely because those burns were milder. So the graph below here, if you look at the percentage mortality here on the y-axis across a range of percentage of crown volume affected or scorched, you can see that we have both species here, ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. But at low levels of crown volume affected, the percent mortality was pretty low. And it's only when you get above a really high level of crown affected where you start getting significant mortality. The line in the graph is the 50% probability of mortality, so that 50-50 chance of a tree living or dying, it only occurred after about between 90 and 95% of the crown scorch. So these young trees are actually quite resistant to fire. And it includes Douglas fir, which surprised me a bit. I thought Douglas fir would do more poorly. But one of the variables that foresters are very interested in is if we do prescribe burning in young stands, are we going to affect tree growth? The answer was slightly. And what we had some control plots within these plantations too that we didn't run a prescribed fire through, and so we were able to compare them against the ones where we burned. And you can see that number, I mean, that the average is not much different from each other. We just had a lot of data, so it was significant. And then if you look at the percentage of or the probability of mortality on the y-axis on the right graph against the percentage of crown volume affected, you can see it was really how much crown was affected that was driving that change in growth. And so if you don't want to lose the growth potential, again, controlling for crown scorch is the way to do that. And so ignition strategies were pretty key for regulating crown scorch. And in this project, there were a number of different burning prescriptions or burning ignition strategies used, ranging from a strip head fire, where you just ignite parallel strips, to tree-centered spot firing, where ignition is around the base of the tree, and then the flames propagate out from there, and they meet in the interstitial spaces between trees. So you have maximum flame length, not underneath the tree, but in the spaces between trees. And we have flanking firing, where fire was brought down perpendicular to the slope to push fire through the stand a little faster. And then we had aerial ignition as well with plastic sphere dispensers. And the ignition strategies that led to in some cases, to plantations with higher mortality were the latter two, the flanking firing and the aerial ignition. There was one plantation where we used strip head firing. There was also higher mortality. And I think that was there was just too many strips were ignited simultaneously. So let me then share with you just this outlier plantation, some lessons learned here. This plantation had 62% of the larger trees died, and it had light pre-burn surface fuel load, but aerial ignition, it had the lowest fuel moisture of any plantation, the highest shrub cover. So it wasn't necessarily that aerial ignition was the problem, because we had 3 other plantations that were ignited through aerial ignition strategies, and we had great effects. So I think it's just a combination of aerial ignition at a time with low fuel moisture and also with high shrub cover with a lot of needle drape in it. So just some lessons learned as we go forward. But it wasn't all gloom and doom, even for the plantations with the highest mortality. And there was a silver lining in that, in a lot of these plantations, the end goal is often to produce a stand with a structural diversity, with multiple age classes. But to do so, you have to start developing stand heterogeneity. And this graph shows a measure of variability, the change in variability created. This is the coefficient of variation of the basal area among our plots, and tree mortality on the x-axis. And you can see that it's only really when you kill some trees that you actually can change the amount of variability in the stand. And so it was the stands that we had the highest mortality, that we now have a more diverse stand condition. So not all bad. So in summary, can prescribed fire be used successfully in young stands? I think the answer is definitely yes. We saw low tree mortality in 8 out of our 9 plantations. Growth slightly reduced, but that was really controlled by the heavily scorched trees. So if you scorch trees less, there's unlikely to be much growth reduction. Mortality was associated with tree size and burn season and the burn conditions, but the outcomes were most strongly influenced by crown scorch, and that's affected by both the amount of fuel on the ground and the ignition strategy. The optimum burn timing, we learned it's really not so much when you burn, but how you burn. And in the case with plantations, patience is really the key. I mean, there's no easy way to push fire through a stand fast, through a stand of young trees fast and get desired effects. You absolutely need patience when burning in young stands. One benefit of patchy mortality that we saw in a couple of plantations was increased stand heterogeneity. And I will leave it there and happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, if we can hold off questions until the end, and you'll have the chance to ask both Eric and Dawn questions during the Q&A period. I will now hand it over to Tori.
All right, and I'm gonna introduce our next speaker, Don Radcliffe. He is a PhD candidate with University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. So I will pass it on to Don, sorry, not Dan. But yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Tori. And thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here and present. I'm Don Radcliffe. I am recently graduated from my PhD, and now I'm a postdoc in Brian Harvey's lab at University of Washington. Yeah, that's right. Are y'all seeing the weird little Zoom guy here?
No.
Oh, okay, great. That's just me. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that our team is doing on long-term field treatment effects in frequent fire forests, and particularly focus on Eastern Washington, although I think there's probably a lot that's relevant for California here. So I imagine that folks in the meeting are probably pretty familiar with field treatments, but basically they're a suite of forest management practices such as thinning and/or prescribed burning that are meant to reduce fuel loads and open up stand structure so that if a wildfire encounters a treatment, hopefully it is of lower severity than it would be in a fire suppressed stand. And I work in frequent fire forests, historically frequent fire forests in particular. And so field treatments are also often used as integral to restoration plans. And the short-term effects of field treatments have been pretty well studied, and they can be summed up really briefly as follows. Burn-only treatments, we know that they can often do a pretty good job of reducing surface fuel and ladder fuel, but at the conservative fire weather conditions or burn implementation that we use, as Eric was talking about, we often have little effect on the overstory, and sometimes we don't want to have a whole lot of effect on the overstory, right? Thin-only treatments are the opposite in some ways. They can do a pretty good job of reducing canopy fuel, but they can also drop a lot of the canopy fuel from the canopy and onto the ground, where they can be a problem for potential surface fire unless subsequent slash management actions are taken. And then thin plus burn treatments, I kind of think of as like the gold standard in field treatment. Thin treatments followed by burning are a nice 1-2 punch where you can reduce your canopy fuel and then bring down the surface fuel and the ladder fuel all in a pretty short time period. So this is all well and good. We're still learning a lot about these short-term stand level effects, but they have been fairly well characterized at a broad level. But the question of how long these effects last or how long our wildfire severity benefits last is much less well resolved in research. And that knowledge gap could lead to a lot of potential issues in management planning with potentials for inefficiencies in treatment maintenance, potential for inability in our ability to evaluate trade-offs between maintaining formerly treated stands versus conducting initial treatments in untreated stands. and also leads to potentially lack of ability to predict what a wildfire is going to do on the ground if it's going through a landscape with a lot of older field treatments, right? And so for all of these reasons, the Washington Department of Natural Resources found that this knowledge gap in treatment longevity was really hindering their ability to write a forest management plan for the east side of the state. And so they funded a team of us centered at UW, along with other agency partners in Washington, to study field treatment longevity, which I was fortunate to be able to head early on in my PhD. And this project really consisted of 3 phases. We're going to focus in on the first 2 today. So the first one, we found and gathered data sets that we could use to look at long-term treatment effects and try to develop some rough estimates for longevity of broad treatment types that are well studied. And that's what we're going to focus in on here. So this was in 2021. We were able to aggregate data from 9 published studies across the West and 3 unpublished data sets in Washington, with field profile data that included field surface field measurements to look at long-term responses. And we developed these relatively rough guidelines for longevity. So burn-only treatments, it looked like they could often do a decent job at reducing surface and ladder fuel for around 10 to 15 years. Remember, this is pretty rough. But thin-only treatments, it looked like those influxes of surface fuel that we talked about that happen in the short term, those could last about 10 years until they decompose, depending, of course, on the specific size, class, and type of fuel. But in that 10-year window, ladder fuel was often able to recover because, you know, saplings and seedlings can escape thinning, where they can develop pretty rapidly into fuel ladders. And then thin and burn showed pretty encouraging results in the long term. You know, surface fuel reductions often around 10 or 15 or 20 years, and ladder and canopy fuel reductions, especially canopy fuel, maybe extending past the 20-year or so window at which they've even been studied. And more studies have come out since that have supported benefits of thin plus burn treatments in the long term, which is really encouraging. However, I don't want you to take those numbers, those hard numbers I just gave you, as the gospel, because there's a lot of caveats that came along with that, you know, analysis. These are relatively qualitative judgments that we made based on data aggregation of a few studies without formal statistics. You know, there's not that many studies out there, especially back in 2021. We know there's wide variation in responses to treatments, both in the short term and especially in the long term. And that happens at multiple scales, right? Within one treated stand, there can be a lot of variation. Among treated stands in a landscape, there can be a lot of variation in responses to treatment, and, you know, certainly among different ecoregions, right? And that leads to a lot of uncertainty about trends. There's other factors that affect long-term treatment results at pretty fine spatial scales. And we're going to touch on some of those a little bit later here. We didn't have the data to look at many different treatment types, especially those that have become more common in recent years, such as mastication. And so hopefully we'll be able to look at those in the future. And we didn't look at shrub responses, which we're definitely very interested in the Washington context, and, you know, which arguably are even more significant in many contexts in California. So all those caveats on this initial first cut judgment of treatment longevity, you know, led us to know that investing in more field data was going to help us get better understanding about treatment longevity. And that brings us to phase 2 of our project. There we go. Had a little lag there, where we collected field data to augment existing data sets. And so again, we found 3 data sets in Washington that already existed that could be used to study field treatment longevity. And we went out and we got more data. We're going to focus in on one of these today because it's the most developed project and it's a relatively short presentation, what we call the Mission Creek site of the Fire and Fire Surrogate study. And that's because it's the most developed. The study is out in Forest Ecology and Management as of last year. And so we're going to go through some really high-level takeaways and not necessarily get into the nitty-gritty here, but if you're interested in that, I'd love to have you check out the paper. So the Mission Creek site is a part of the Fire and Fire Surrogates study, which is a broader study if you're familiar with it. There's 2 sites in California. That was an experiment set up to test the effects of common field treatment types that we've been talking about today. It was set up to study frequent fire forests. So in our case, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine type forests in central Washington. And these treatments, these experimental treatments that you see here were implemented in the early 2000s at our study site. I was able to begin my PhD 15 years after those treatments by going in and leading resampling of field profiles and forest structure to give us a long-term data set to work with. Some of the high-level takeaways on that. First of all, thin plus burn treatment kind of across the board showed the strongest long-term effects among those study treatments, both in terms of magnitude of long-term responses and most consistent among plot long-term responses for most of our response variables except for surface fuel. And this maybe pops out best visually on this NMDS ordination that you see in front of you. And if you're not familiar with that, ordination is just a series of methods of taking a lot of variables and abstracting them onto 2 dimensions so that we can look at patterns in multivariate space in kind of a way that we can understand. And the takeaway from this graph is that in the bottom right here, all these arrows under the thin plus burn box represent individual plots and how they change from the pre-treatment time period into the long term. And we see more consistent changes and greater magnitude of changes towards more open stand structure with less chance of canopy fire as we move from pre-treatment into long term when we compare that to the other experimental treatment types here. And what this might look like on the ground is something like this. Thin plus burn treatments are often pretty intense in terms of their overstory removal. And it's going to take more than 15 years probably for those canopy fuel loads and those basal areas to recover. But surface fuel, moves on finer time scales, and we can see that here on this pretty productive site. We've got a lot of shrub and sapling response to treatment, and we can't quite see in the photo, but there's probably a lot of surface fuel as well. But we didn't just want to compare our long-term results to pre-treatment levels because those aren't necessarily always the most management relevant basis of comparison. And so another analysis that we did was we modeled fire behavior and severity on a plot level. And then for 4 of the metrics that we modeled, we compared plot level outcomes to goals that we thought might be management goals for our area for surface flame length, basal area mortality, torching index, and crowning index. And all this graph shows is that for surface flame length and for basal area mortality, there was no combination of time period and treatment where the majority of plots met those management goals that we set for all right, if we just, say that we have a goal for what the potential surface flame length could be, these plots aren't meeting that goal. However, for crowning index, which is the wind speed that is required to maintain an active crown fire, all of the treatment period and treatment combinations met the goals for crowning index. So we're doing pretty good in terms of potential for active crown fire. What this looks like on the ground might be something like this, kind of like Eric's plantation stands in a lot of ways. You could imagine this was a plantation that got treated even, where we've got pretty widely spaced trees and we've got good species composition, things that we like, but there might be some things that we don't like as much going on, such as high surface fuel loads, which could lead to tree mortality. And, we're often working with relatively small trees, as we can see even in this picture, for reasons that Eric talked about, and because, as we know, there's a legacy of high-grade logging, taking all of the largest, most fire-resistant trees, or most of them, I should say, across big parts of the interior West. Okay, another key lesson from this was that pre-treatment values are pretty consistently important for predicting long-term responses. That happened for a lot of response variables. Here we're using basal area and crowning index as an example. And what you see here is that pre-treatment value on the x-axis in these generalized linear mixed model prediction plots. Pre-treatment value is correlated positively with predicted long-term response, with pretty big effect sizes across those gradients of different pre-treatment values, but also quite wide confidence intervals in some cases. Not super surprising that pretreatment value is going to be related to long-term response when you consider the variability, the huge levels of variability that exist in these forests sometimes. You might imagine that pretreatment value indicates something about the abiotic conditions, about the disturbance history, and about the overall capacity of a stand to respond to treatment over time. And then last but not least, treatment intensity had pretty strong long-term effects on stand structure and on canopy fuel, but again, not so much on fuel loads. And so we measured treatment intensity with a satellite index, which we see on the x-axis here. And what these model prediction plots are showing is greater treatment intensity led to lower predicted basal area in the long term and a higher wind speed required to maintain an active crown fire in the long term. So both good things from treatment intensity there. And again, we're back to this theme where, you know, these metrics that are really driven by large trees like basal area and canopy fire, they're going to take a long time to respond to treatment, and that can vary at a pretty fine scale, like we can see in the picture here. All right, so the bottom line from the Mission Creek study for this presentation, at least, is that for thin and burn treatment and for more intensely applied treatments of other kinds, we can actually do a pretty good job of reducing canopy fire potential into the long term, or, you know, 15 years following treatment in this case, but not so much for surface fire and, you know, surface flame potential. And so whether or not a stand like this should be maintained, you know, 10 or 15 or 20 years following treatment might depend on how valuable a particular stand is, you know, if there's any adjacent resources, and what are the trade-offs between maintaining a stand like this versus maybe conducting a treatment in a stand that hasn't been treated before and may have greater fuel loads in more different kinds of fuel classes. Stay tuned on this. So, you know, I recently finished my PhD, mostly focusing on treatment longevity, and we're working on getting more of our studies out. And we also, our team received a Joint Fire Sciences Program grant, which is funding a 2-year postdoc for me to continue working on this stuff. So we're thinking about lots of aspects of treatment longevity, and we're going to keep going into a lot of detail on this. So with that, I got a lot of people to thank, my awesome collaborators, lots of people that helped me out with various technical questions and finding data sets that were out there. My funding sources, without which I wouldn't be here, the Harvey Lab, which has been an eternal source of support, and maybe most importantly, the field crew members that gave a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to help me get the data that helped make this study possible. And with that, I'll stop sharing. And I think we have time for questions.
Thanks so much, Don. And yeah, at this point, we have time for questions, both for Don and Eric. So you can put them in the chat if you don't feel like raising your hand and speaking out loud, or you could just raise your hand and Katie and I will call on you.
I guess to start us off, while folks maybe think of some questions, I had a question for Eric about the ignition patterns used in the study. I don't know a ton about the different ignition patterns. Does the tree-centered spot firing, is that exponentially more like labor intensive than the other methods that you used?
Yeah, I don't think so necessarily. It's just kind of a spot fire pattern. I think it actually probably uses less drip torch fuel. It just means you're just igniting just around the base of the tree and letting the fire creep into the interstitial spaces. Yeah, it's just a different pattern. I don't think it's more labor intensive.
Thank you.
We had a question about how do treatments affect the influx of invasive species. I'm not entirely sure who that was going for, but maybe for Dawn?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, it's a great question because we know that treatments can definitely facilitate invasion of species. And in Washington, obviously we have cheatgrass as a pretty prominent issue. And we've seen some of that move in, especially after wildfire that happened adjacent to our study area. And I was doing some work in the Blue Mountains of Oregon, and they had, a lot more invasive species issues than even we had in Central Washington. There is a paper by Allison Rossman that looks at the understory communities and the shrub communities at Mission Creek. And I don't remember all the details on invasives there, but for more of a scientific treatment of that question, that paper does a great job with that.
Awesome. And then Cleo.
Hi, yeah, thanks both for your presentations. I think this is mostly for Don, but Eric, you might also have thoughts on this. It looked like, in terms of the ground fuel loading in the photo that you were showing, it looked like, there's quite a lot of older logs on the ground. And I'm just thinking about, some of these post-wildfire conditions where you might have a lot of standing dead trees that maybe you get them onto the ground, but there still is, quite a lot of like legacy fuels on the ground. And I was wondering, how your different stands fared as far as that kind of pre-treatment condition, and also just, yeah, what the recommendation might be in terms of trying to burn through those, as it were.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cleo. That's a great question because it's definitely like prominent in any kind of like instance that we've studied of going in and conducting sort of an initial treatment of a fire suppressed stand. You can't just take care of all of the surface fuel hazard in one treatment or one combination of treatments, because all that stuff is hanging out in the canopy waiting to come down. And one of the things that we'll hopefully get out in a study soon is a fuel succession model that we've been working on based on some more high temporal resolution monitoring that we've got. We've got these like beautiful paintings from Bob Van Pelt we're really excited about. But one of the things that some of our data is showing is, yeah, you have a big influx after a prescribed burn or even a thin plus burn of fine woody surface fuel coming in like 3 to 5 to 10 years following treatment. And then coarser woody surface fuel, like you were talking about, the big logs start to fall after that. And we don't have the kind of sampling frequency to look at that in the study that I showed you, but we do have a lot of coarse fuel in our long-term sample in that study. And so it's definitely a concern, and it's one of those things that, like, yeah, if you really value a particular stand and you want that stand to be in like a not fully, but like a restored or a resilient state, follow-up treatment is going to be needed. But if you're in a landscape triage mode where you just have a lot of land that's untreated, you might be better off with the lower canopy fire potential in your old stands over here, and taking care of some of the stands that are in more dire need if you have like NEPA clearance and stuff in other areas. I don't know, that got a little rambly. I don't know if that answered all of your question, but I got lots of thoughts, so thank you for that.
And Eric, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Well, my study doesn't really address that, but yeah,
Fair.
like Don mentioned, you can't, it's not one and done with prescribed fire, as maintenance is clearly needed.
We
Sorry,
had,
I'm just checking the chat to make sure we don't have anything else.
yeah, just for those who might not be able to see the chat, someone asked how old were the young stands that were exposed to prescribed fire in Eric's study, and Eric already answered this, but he said 22 to 35 years of age. And then Dawn also just linked the study that he mentioned in chat as well. we still have a couple more minutes. Does anyone want to ask either of our speakers another question? Well, if not, I think we can wrap this up on time. So thank you so much to both Eric and Dawn for presenting today and for sharing your knowledge with all of us. This is the last webinar in our Hot Topics series, but you can expect similar webinars from the Fire Network very soon. You can go ahead and check our website, ucanr.edu/site/fire, to learn more about the events that we're going to be hosting in the coming months. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.